Hey folks, so this video's topic is going to be on the ancestors. So I covered in the last video about how there are three basic categories of beings in heathenry, and that's the gods, ancestors, and the spirits, or I'm going to frequently refer to them as Vatir. Others might refer to them as wits or whites. So ancestors are, in my reckoning, any being that is related to you by blood and bone, by adoption, by spirit, by lineage, or by interests. So what do I mean by interests? Well, I don't mean, necessarily like you relate to the ancestors of stamp collecting. You might, which, your ancestors that you adopt are your ancestors. So a lot of folks will really focus very heavily on the blood ancestors, and they're important, don't get me wrong. Without them, we wouldn't be here. But they're not the only ancestors that we can honor in heathenry. We can honor the ancestors that adopt us or that we have adopted. We can honor ancestors of lineage if we have that. And by lineage, I mean, like for instance, professions that might have long lines of folks who were well known in them, or for whom there is a master and apprentice relationship with, such as the trade skills. So we might relate to ancestors of a given profession that we're involved in. You might relate to the pipe fitters, or the masons, or the loggers, or what have you. Those might be an entire category of ancestors that you give honor to because you recognize their sacrifices and you recognize that you relate to those in an ancestral way. You might be interested in hunting, and so these might be ancestors that you form a connection with and a bond with that you might not have in terms of blood or adoption or lineage. So there's a lot of different ways that we can bring ancestors into our ancestor practice, and a lot of ways that we can develop relationships with them. One of the simplest ways is one that I first learned from African traditional religions that I eventually ended up adapting to my own practice, and that is a simple white cloth with a glass of water and a picture of an ancestor or some kind of statue representing the ancestors. And then you develop a relationship with the closest ancestors if you had a decent relationship with them. In the way that I practice, I go further back if they were abusive, but I am very lucky in that my ancestors weren't abusive and weren't horrible to one another too much. So my recommendation is, if you can, the last generation that you knew, develop a relationship with them. And if you're adopted, you might have representations. If you don't know who, for instance, the birth parents that you had were, you might have a representation of a statue about yay big. You can start out small. Some of these altars, they tend to grow. When I use the word altar, I'm being fairly generic with it. Some folks differentiate between a shrine and altar. An altar is a workspace, and a shrine is a place where you make offerings and you develop spiritual connections. I'll sometimes mix the two terms. Sometimes I'll be more discerning. But like, the long story short is, it needs to be a sacred place where you can meet your ancestors and develop relationships with them. In some ways, it's easier for some folks to develop relationships with gods because we have the names and we have the understanding of who these gods and goddesses were, and they're part of the religion, whereas we might have ancestors who were completely opposed to anything pagan. I would, in addition to speaking with your most recent dead ancestors that you knew, I would also talk to the pagan dead, whether they're heathen or Celtic, however you relate to them. Because let's be real, in heathenry, you don't have to be exclusively heathen to be a heathen. You can worship gods of any pantheon or culture group that you wish. Pantheon's kind of a funny misnomer that we apply in the modern age. I worship gods that are Egyptian or Kemetic, Greek, or Roman. So why would we limit our ancestors to just one culture group? It seems a bit odd to me. So you might, as time goes on, when you develop good connections with your ancestors, you might branch out and start bringing in different ancestors from culture groups that you relate to, or ancestors from the culture groups that you draw your practice from. So the ancestors are, at least as how I understand them in heathenry, first and foremost, they're there to have our backs because we are the latest iteration of their bloodlines. Even if you don't plan on having kids, they have a vested interest in seeing you succeed. So having a good relationship with them is a very positive thing, both for you and for them, because we're part of how their names and their stories and their ways live on. So, like I said, they have a vested interest in us doing well. Now, when it comes to ancestors and abusive ancestors, again, I don't think you have to worship abusive ancestors. That might be something that you need to work on or work with them on later on. And again, as I said with the gods bit, this is a highly individual thing, and you might never be okay with working with abusive ancestors, and I personally wouldn't put that on anybody. But if you find down the road that you need to do ancestor work, healing wounds, or that kind of thing, that's something that you might want to engage with a priest and a divination on. I would highly recommend that, and not going it alone. Now, we're going to put that bit aside for now. The ancestors, like I said, they're supposed to have our backs, and there's lots of them. I recognize also within my practice that there are about 4 main categories of powerful ancestors, and that is the Disir, and these tend to be powerful female ancestors. The Disir may also be goddesses. If you go back far enough, without saying too much about any one category, the long and the short of it is the powerful ancestors are there to organize the various ancestors and to help smooth things out. So you have the Disir. Now, I differentiate between the Alfar and the male dead. I do not relate to the Alfar, which translates to elves, as male dead. I relate to the Alfar as Alfar, and I relate to our powerful male dead under the German name for fathers, Väter. V-A with an umlaut, T-E-R. Now, again, they serve a very similar function to the Disir in that they help get our family lines organized and they take care of their descendants. Now, this next category of powerful ancestors, some folks will deeply disagree with me using this term, but suffice it to say, we know that the term was used on people and that recognizing these ancestors is something they've wanted me to do. And so that's my bit of gnosis on that. And I call this group the Ergi. Now, Ergi was an insult and meant coward or somebody that was acting unmanly, and it was frequently used against people who would engage in acts of cowardice, or, more relevant to my interests, Seidmaður. That is, men who engaged in Seidr, which is a form of magic and divination and an entire category of magic work in general. Then you have the last category, which I came across because of some wonderful folks in the Skith Blathnir Discord who turned me on to this. It's called Thvr, and it's related to the word for queer, and it means something to the effect of to be twisted or to be, not in a bad way, but just to be different. Long story short, it's etymologically related to the word queer. And so Thvr is another category that I use for powerful ancestors, and these are the queer powerful ancestors. And so I give cultists to these 4 powerful groups of ancestors, as well as all the other ancestors that are in my lines as blood, adoption, lineage, spirit, and interests. So that's a very basic overview of one heathen's look at ancestors. Like with a lot of these subjects, you may or may not hear different stuff from different folks based on their culture background, based on how they relate to the ancestors. So you're going to hear different stuff from different folks, and that's fine. I am not the only voice in heathenry that should be heard. So when you hear people say, well, ancestors are just this, that's probably just their personal culture focus, and that's might just be how they relate to them. I have to tackle this subject it's a bit uncomfortable, but you can't really exist in heathenry as an anti-racist and not tackle it. So let me just be perfectly blunt. You don't have to have white European ancestry to be a heathen. You don't have to in any way, shape, or form have white skin or white ancestry or be related to any of the European peoples to worship our gods, ancestors, or Vatir. We're not a closed practice. Anybody can come to the gods, ancestors, and Vatir of heathenry. I don't care where you come from or how you come from, so long as you're not a white supremacist or a TERF or some other discriminating jackass. I don't care. But Nazis, white supremacists, and TERFs can all fuck right off. So we're going to leave it there. And next episode, we're going to pick up with the Vatir, the spirits. See you then.